Religious texts can be inspiring, but also really hard to digest. Patriarchal references or violence can make believers really struggle. In this video, we asked our participants to tell us about religious texts that they struggle with, and we asked them how they negotiate them.
In Shemot, in Exodus, in one of the Aseret HaDibrot, in one of the 10 Commandments, we have the line, Lo tachmod eshes ra'echa, do not covet thy neighbor's wife, classic translation. And I always found that very difficult. It's one thing to contextualize rabbinic work and talk about the male perspective because of the time or the patriarchal nature of their culture or society. I find it very difficult, and still very difficult, persistently difficult, to understand how a God speaking to the entire nation can say, you must not covet your neighbor's wife. Who is the you in that scenario? Where are the women? Are they invisible? How can it be that God is contextualized socially, culturally? So that for me has always remained the most problematic text.
I think when it comes to religious texts, the challenge for me actually has been that most of them have been, the commentaries have all been male centered, so done by men. And so, of course, it brings a different slant.
Definitely Ephesians 5:22, which is the wives submit to your husbands.
There are quite a few to choose from, in truth, when we think about Judaism and its sources and its rich textual tradition. But I think the one that I would pick up on is the famous dictum from Rabbi Eliezer in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Tractate of Sota, where he makes this key comment that you shouldn't teach your daughters Torah, and if you do so, it's this notion of tiflut, and the translation of that is complex, but essentially it's frivolity. And that's a particularly challenging text, which I think highlights an approach to gender relations and the opportunities for women that emphasizes a more marginalizing perspective, which has done enormous damage, I think, to women's place in Jewish community life.
Personally, I think Islam is a very balanced religion between men and women. It speaks of separately both to men and women and together. However, the text that I thought growing up was very difficult was about men being financially responsible for women.
So I'm no expert on this, but I think there are lots of things that strike me. First of all, it strikes me how few women there are in leading roles, if you like, in the world of scripture. So all of the leading people are men. And of course, that's sort of historical, that's how it was, but it is nonetheless excluding. I also find it excluding the way that the prayer books, or Siddurim, are written with everything in the male gender. So I've navigated this problem in two ways, I guess. One of them is by being a member of a progressive synagogue, which navigates a lot of it for me. In progressive Judaism, Reform or liberal Judaism, these books are being rewritten to make them gender neutral. So we no longer talk about God as he. We no longer talk about the Lord. There's just different language. And whilst for many people this sounds petty, as a woman, it is not petty. It actually enables me to be included in a way that previously I was excluded.
I find much reassurance from the plethora of biblical texts, rabbinic texts, contemporary texts, all discussing these issues, who themselves struggle with the gender questions that I too have. That's one way that I deal with it. And the second way really is through female role models.
So what I'm really enjoying at the moment are tackling some of the more difficult issues, but looking at it from a perspective from women as well, and looking at women writers and challenging some of those things myself. And even this year, I read a verse from the Quran and someone was talking through it with me in a way that I've never done before, but very particularly about a woman. So I think that kind of learning is very exciting, but we need much more of it, and women need to be at the table, I think, with men discussing these things together.
If we take the text of Ephesians 5:22 to look at different interpretations, especially feminist interpretations of it, but I think that it's very easy to find a more egalitarian and empowering interpretation that is about mutual submission and also empowerment. But also, I think we need to look broadly at the Christian tradition to look at the role of women and the value that they have. And I think the thing that comes to mind immediately is that women were the first ones to discover the empty tomb at the resurrection of Christ. So actually, the movement of Christianity that we see throughout the New Testament is the result of the faith of women. And that needs to be emphasized more often. Our faith would have not spread had it not been for women faithfully going to the tomb and reporting that back to the disciples. And that, I think, is incredibly vital.
Growing up, and when I understood the text, the context behind why God has said this, it's felt quite liberating that I didn't actually need to be a financial contributor to the family, as well as being the primary carer for children, teacher, educator, etc. However, cultural reading does not left out the fact that Islam does allow women to work, and any earning that the women have, they don't necessarily have to spend it within the household. That's their money. However, if they do want to choose to spend it, then that's is an act of charity.
Whilst on the one hand, it's such a challenging text that emphasizes this idea of trying to marginalize and limit women's access to Jewish education, the pushback against that model is precisely what has empowered women to understand that when they return to the sources, when they find the means of interpreting these texts in more creative ways, the truism it comes through that knowledge is power. And so the efforts to remove that access to knowledge are challenging. And when that access to knowledge is acquired, it shows what's possible.